Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Most of the great things that were ever achieved in this country came from the labour movement. Trade unions in the workplace, labour in parliament, and municipal power across the country. That's not to say that everything they did was good or that they never did anything bad, just that few of the good things would have happened without them. 20 years ago, however, with the advent of Tony Blair and New Labour, the party profoundly changed its character, along with its relationship to the trade unions, who this week, in 1900, gave birth to the Labour Party at their foundation conference.
114 years on, the party is set to relegate to history their relationship with the unions at a special conference. Its platform, attitudes, policies and principles now bear little resemblance to what was set out in that foundation conference in 1900. And today we're asking the question, the Labour Party, what's left?
Our guest to discuss this is one of the most important men in the most important unions in the country. My own union, Unite, which I joined on Christmas Eve 1973 as the Transport and General Workers Union. He's Andrew Murray. Andrew, welcome to Sputnik. Is it the end at this special conference of the relationship between organised labour and the party which bore their name?
No, it's certainly a dramatic change, but it's not the end. After the special conference, all the most important or the largest trade unions in the country will remain affiliated to the Labour Party. That connection will still be there. There's going to be a difficult process of change over 5 years, a 5-year period to 2020. At the end of that, will the landscape look different? Quite possibly. But as of now, I think all the major unions are still with the Labour Party, and in particular are with the effort to get the present government out of office, which means inevitably, unavoidably, fighting for a Labour victory at next year's general election.
Well, few of us have 2020 vision, but I mean, aren't the unions being treated like the embarrassing elderly relative drooling in the attic, kept away from visitors and polite company?
There has been a lot of that since the start of New Labour, maybe even elements of it before. There isn't a golden age of the Union-Labour Party relationship. It's always been fractious, it's always been difficult. You'll remember very well from the 1970s how difficult that relationship got. Of course, it changed.
Beer and sandwiches at Downing Street with Labour Prime Ministers, you can hardly imagine it now.
No, you can't.
Neither the beer nor the sandwiches nor the visitors.
No, that is a piece of history, and I don't think that will come back. I hope Ed Miliband's Prime Minister after the next election, but he doesn't look like a beer and sandwiches man particularly to me. But the relationship will be changing. I think where we are with Ed Miliband is in a better place than where we were with Tony Blair, because Tony Blair had a really ingrained contempt for organised labour and ingrained contempt for many of the values of the party he came to leave, if not all of them.
Just 2 days ago, Alistair Campbell was out at a public fundraiser for New Labour. Peter Mandelson is back on the creep, endorsing Ed Balls as one of the few men who understand the modern economy. And Tony Blair has been reinstated to an election position, albeit in the second tier, but nonetheless far from banished. And of course the shadow cabinet is still, notwithstanding recent changes, still dominated, or at least with a very substantial force of Blair New Labour types, holding in many cases Ed Miliband to hostage.
Well, none of that is wrong, George, but I think there is a battle going on. Firstly, let's not ever think it was all radically different. I mean, right now there is a lively and not unjustified nostalgia for the 1945 Labour government that introduced the National Health Service, that maintained full employment, that nationalised many key industries. Yet you'll be well aware that that same government launched many colonial wars of aggression, took Britain into NATO, took Britain into the Korean War, which in the end undid its social programme. So even back then, in what is now regarded as a golden age of Labour, there was a battle going on between progressive and reactionary or more right-wing elements. Now, today, everything you say is right. On the other hand, one could say, well, Ed Miliband has said he will tackle energy prices, he will force house building, a big house building programme, he'll repeal the bedroom tax. It's the old question, which people say, is the glass half full or is it half empty? Which I always say isn't a Marxist approach to water in glass. The question is it filling up or draining away? And who can actually give a categorical answer to this? I don't think anyone could be certain, but there is an argument going on. I'm convinced that union voices are being heard in that. Public opinion, even the dimmest New Labour apparatchik, is vaguely aware that after the crash of 2008, the old model can't be brought back to life intact. They realise something has to be done differently. And these things will be resolved to some degree on the power of the contending forces. If the trade unions get their act together politically and industrially, rebuild their strength, that will be an important weight in the scales. And that's why Len McCluskey warned this week...
The leader of Unite.
Leader of Unite, the General Secretary of Unite, warned against any prospect of a Lib-Lab agreement after the next general election, if there's another hung parliament, because the presence of people like Clegg, the Orange Book, free market liberals, in alliance with some of those elements in the shadow cabinet that you rightly say have hardly broken from the neoliberal dogmas of the past, that, of course, would fatally compromise the best intentions of Ed Miliband and the Social Democrats in the Labour Party.
When I attended my first Labour Party conference in 1974, we, the unions, had 80% of the voting power in that conference. We elected a National Executive Committee which had real power, was a real powerful organ in the party, and the unions were overwhelmingly decisive in those elections. They elected the treasurer, they elected the trade union section, and the constituency Labour parties were, of course, to the left of the unions in those days. When I entered Parliament in 1987 with my transport workers badge on, we were some 40 or 50 sponsored members of Parliament by the union. In fact, Labour leaders like Tony Blair scampered to join our group as trade union sponsored. That era is now completely gone. Now nobody wears a trade union badge in Parliament, I can assure you. And indeed, the class composition of the Labour Party is overwhelmingly changed. When I entered Parliament, more than 100, maybe 150 MPs were what you could clearly say were blue-collar, working-class MPs. Now you'd be lucky to find 5 or 10. Indeed, the whole Falkirk imbroglio was about the need to get a working-class Labour MP into Parliament. I take your view that no one can predict the outcome of this next period, but you sound rather more confident about it than I.
I'm resolved, I think, resolved to be in the struggle. Optimism of the will. That's my attitude towards this. There aren't any predetermined outcomes, obviously. This debate takes place against enormous setbacks for socialism in the world and the labour movement in Britain and other countries over the last generation. We haven't recovered fully from those setbacks. But you have to come back to the position. We have a general election a little over a year away. Realistically, in the great majority of constituencies, the choice is re-electing a candidate from the coalition parties or a candidate from the Labour Party, and that's something where we have to fight to make the best of, in my opinion, at this juncture. If after a general election we find we're in a different political situation emerging, for the better or the worse. Of course, we have to make the best judgments we can at that time.
Andrew, coming from the Netherlands, the way I see it is that the Labour Party, the classical formation of the Labour Party, changing and moving further away from its original principles, is not unique to UK. It's throughout Europe.
That's certainly the case. The problems we're discussing are international ones, certainly pan-European ones. The same factors that have impacted on the British Labour Party in a particularly lurid form are present generally. Of course, each country also has its own background. In some countries, France, Italy, there was powerful communist parties at one stage. I know there is a powerful left of Labour Party in the Netherlands with its own roots and
Netherlands and Germany.
But I still think
Germany's a good example, no?
Yeah, well, Germany, of course, is a unique, absolutely unique, that half the country, or a third of the country, used to be socialist. And that, of course, is where the main electoral base of Die Linke exists. That's not a situation we can recreate in Britain, when none of the country has ever been socialist.
No, especially now with the system.
So let's look, but I think the general issue, which is still reuniting the principles of socialism with the mass of working class political people through their organisations, that still remains the task. And if I say I think now there's still an argument to be had, a battle to be fought in the Labour Party, I don't at all set myself up to go to the Netherlands or to France or to Spain and say that they would make the same choice in their circumstances. There are differences.
Andrew Murray, thanks for that. A good argument. We'll have to continue it. Let's hope we're both still here in 2020 with clear vision. Coming up after the break, we'll be looking at the breakup of the Ukraine, which looks increasingly likely following the Western-funded and backed coup which has taken place in Kiev. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik. When we discussed Ukraine on Sputnik just a couple of weeks ago, few could have predicted the pace and the shape of things to come. A fascist anti-Semitic squad of street fighters, as some are calling them, then scarcely seemed capable of overthrowing the government, binning the constitution, and beginning a process which may well lead to the dismemberment of their country. But they have.
The Ukrainian president is now apparently yet another resident of a Moscow hotel, while an unelected pretender to his post is seeking a bailout of billions from the EU, which the people of Greece had earlier been told could not be afforded, and the absence of which created the whole crisis in the Ukraine in the first place. Today we're asking the question, the Ukraine was right.
Joining us now to discuss developments in the Ukraine is writer, commentator and candidate in the forthcoming European elections, Nick Wright. Nick, thanks for joining us. When we last dealt with this, it looked like Yanukovych had a problem, but that it was unlikely that the groups on the square would succeed in overthrowing him. But they have. How do you account for that?
External factors, I think, are determining here. The Ukraine sits at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. It's always been an area where competing interests have clashed. In this case, the post-war settlement, if you like, flowing from the defeat of fascism, has unravelled, arising principally from the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but also through the eastward expansion of the European Union and, of course, NATO. So the borders of Russia with Western Europe, if you like, traditionally or historically the border between socialism and capitalism, no longer characterised in that way, has moved further to the east. That's creating enormous tensions within Russia, but also it's presenting enormous opportunities for very powerful forces in the West, in the European Union, in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Germany and Poland seem to be playing a leading role. Who would have thought that that would turn out to be the case? But let's analyse the forces at work in the square, in the Independence Square, the Maidan. Just describe for us, if you would, what's right and what's anything else amongst those forces?
Well, they reflect really these external pressures. Interestingly, Germany, which of course is driving the European motor in this particular incident, and generally speaking, in fact, its preferred man, Klitschko, is really unable to perform the role that German capital is assigned to him. And more dynamic and certainly deeply reactionary forces have set the pace in Independence Square in Kiev. And they reflect not just the pressure of capital and of the Western alliances, but also the unravelling of the tensions within Ukrainian society. If you think of the Ukraine as being a country in which the surrounding nationalities all interact, you can see that it's always a political problem, no matter who's the dominant political force there. For instance, at the end of the Second World War, we had a situation in which, as the Nazi army retreated and the Red Army advanced, other forces came into play, and so we have Hungarian, Polish, and national minorities who are part of population movements. Take the city which is the centre of the neo-fascist force in contemporary Ukraine. Before the Second World War, it was the largest population of Jewish people in the country. Now it's denuded of Jews for the well-known historical reasons. And anti-Semitism, of course, is a very active factor in all of this, with the competing nationalisms and the competing commercial, political and economic interests.
You can have anti-Semitism without Jews. And in fact, in the Ukraine now, there are very few Jews. But one of the remaining rabbis in Kiev has called on Jews to actually leave the city and maybe leave the country. Such is the resurgent anti-Semitism and neo-fascism, in some cases, outright fascism and others, of these forces that have now come to the fore. The European Union and the United States are going to find that a very difficult horse to ride, no?
Well, they've set this hare running and they can't control it, really. There's an attempt here by the forces, the most reactionary forces in Ukrainian society, to make themselves more presentable to the European Union, because selling this package to people in Eastern Europe is very, very difficult. I mean, one of the frankly offensive things taking place is the way in which the BBC described the Nazi collaborators who continue to fight against Soviet power in the Ukraine after the Second World War as partisans, appropriating the term, if you like, that's
of the people that they were murdering and assisting the Nazis to murder.
Which describes anti-fascist fighters throughout the whole of Europe. There's a serious attempt here to manipulate public opinion, to reshape our understanding of history, and that's vitally important. I mean, you have to think, I think you have to take an historical view, a longer view of what's happening in Ukraine, to see the forces that are in play today are, in some senses, continuation of forces that were in play before the Second World War, during the Second World War, and after.
The Nazi occupation.
Absolutely.
Now, Russia hasn't really spoken yet. It's impossible to imagine that Russia can accept that the 45% or so of Ukrainian citizens who are Russian-speaking, and including ethnic Russians in very substantial numbers in the south and the east of the country, can be left to the tender mercies of the revanchist forces that we're talking about. So what could Russia do?
Well, Russia's got national interests in here, but national interests, I think, are also shot through with economic interests as well. And there are various economic forces at play here. And the various regimes, in particular the leadership of the Party of the Regions, has obviously had its eye on the importance of the economic relationship with Russia, particularly gas, energy supplies. But Europe, or rather the Europe actually, have an interest in this as well, because this is a transit point. So it's critically important for all kinds of economic interests. I mean, Tymoshenko, another reactionary, irreparably corrupt and compromised figure, reflects, if you like, that dichotomy. One day she leans to the west, one day she leans to the east. If there's profit to be made in the deal on the east, she'll take it. If
she was known as the gas princess.
Absolutely. But at the same time, she plays games with the west. She plays games with the most reactionary forces in Eastern Galicia in particular, and is in competition with them for votes in that part of the world. I suspect that all of the political formations, possibly with the exception of the Ukrainian Communist Party are in a state of great flux at the moment, and we may well see some political realignments.
Will the country split up? I mean, is partition of the country a possibility?
I think it's a possibility, but I think there are powerful interests against that, both in the European Union and in Russia. I think there is some pressure, and this may reflect tensions inside the European Union and tensions between the European Union and the United States. There's that well-publicised spat between the USA and the European Union a few weeks ago. There are tensions there which may mean that people would prefer a federal solution to the national question in the Ukraine. And clearly, when you look at a map of the Ukraine, I mean, if you impose the British first past the post electoral system on the Ukraine, there'd probably be half a dozen seats, of which would be swing seats. The rest are fairly clearly identified on one side or the other. But it's a very fragmented picture, you know, it's not east and west, it's there are national minorities, there are linguistic groups, there are economic interests. For instance, there's several dozen MPs elected in the last election who weren't on any of the party lists. They had a serious local base. So it's a much more complex political situation in the Ukraine than I think the simplistic analyses which are predominant in the media in Britain and Western Europe and the United States really allow for.
But the president is now seemingly out of the country, and new government is being formed, but the people on the streets still don't seem very satisfied. Are they not just a bunch of hooligans?
There's a very powerful hooligan element in there, that's absolutely true. But I think there's also one of the factors driving the movement on the streets is the deep revulsion right throughout Ukrainian society against corruption. And this is the inevitable consequence of the breakup of the Soviet Union and of the encroachment of foreign capital with particular interests, and also the way in which people were able, some very corrupt people and criminal people were able to aggregate enormous wealth. They've appropriated collective social public property. It's now private property, and with that comes the inevitable corruption, and with that political stresses and strains. But I think what's driving the street has been over the last few weeks has been the actions of the far right, who are particularly well organised and supported. Very interesting. And funded. Very interesting commentary in the Chinese press just the last couple of days, which pointed to the theatrical, orchestrated, visual nature of the protests in central Kiev, in which they had a kind of spectacle air about them. But for instance, you know, these flames. Every time the flames died down, somebody would put a bit more kerosene on them so that the cameras had a dramatic image. And I think we have to be very critical of the media in this country. I mean, Channel 4 News, which is probably one of the better news services in Britain, had some frankly appalling coverage from Matt Fry. Of course, he's got a big track record in Central Europe and Germany. You know, and I think we have to be very sensitive to what the different forces are at play here and how these are represented in the media. The political reality on the ground is more complex than it appears on the surface.
Nick Wright, thanks for joining us on Sputnik. Now it's your turn to tell us what you think in the social media review. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Labour Party, what's left? Someone under the name Theresa May says, left, right, when the light goes dark and they're all in the shadows, there's no difference. They are all literally in it together.
What a wonderful tweet. That can't be the real Mrs. Theresa May.
I don't think so either.
But it's a wonderfully profound observation.
Very cool.
I must say Andrew is very sanguine about... I didn't want to embarrass him, but the unions are paying a huge sum of money, many millions of pounds every year, for clearly and clearly delineated diminishing returns. Yeah. Anyway, go on.
Wake Up UK says Labour brings nothing to the table except embarrassment. And this is exactly the line which was in The Guardian this past week about Tony Blair, of course.
How Blair has gone from an icon to an embarrassment. Yeah. But Miliband doesn't seem able to shake him off.
Another good one from Russell Bland saying, how about right Labour? Quite catchy, double meaning, yet only one is correct. their right, as in Tory right.
I don't actually myself accept that. We will, of course, be discussing both the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, for that matter, over the course of the next months, and no doubt that will become apparent.
So the Ukraine was right there. To which Maya replies, NATO hawks are already swooping in. They've been waiting for this. And then Andrew Richard comes with, I believe the definite article isn't right anymore. The Ukraine was the old Soviet label.
Imagine me making a mistake like that.
That's all we've got time for this week.
Which sadly means that's the end of the show.
Meantime, you can reach us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook, you know it, it's Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.